What kind of Prime Minister gives his country's territory away to a foreign power without even asking Parliament? His name is Keir Starmer, and the territory, the Chagos Islands. Britain's Prime Minister was warned by security experts not to give away the Chagos Islands because they're incredibly important to national security. However, Keir Starmer ignored them and handed them over to tiny Mauritius, which some say is a bit too cosy with China. Some have praised the left-wing Starmer for doing the politically correct thing, closing another colonial chapter, but others accuse him of needlessly selling out his own country. Coming up, a former Tory MP and a Chagossian rights campaigner tell us why they are against the deal, and a UN expert tells us why she's broadly pro the deal. But first, let's find out why it's so controversial.
Countries go to war over territory. Nearly 100 nations are involved in an armed conflict right now around the globe, more than at any other time since World War II. But when it comes to the Chagos Islands, Keir Starmer's giving them away with a stroke of his pen.
The single most important thing was ensuring that we had a secure base.
The islands are incredibly remote, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, the kind of spot which you really have to zoom in on using Google Maps. But it's not the size that counts, it's what you do with them. And the biggest of these 60 islands is Diego Garcia, home to one of America's most strategically important military bases. It's from here that America launched countless airstrikes on Afghanistan and Iraq. All of Africa is within easy reach, as is America's only superpower rival, China. So why is Britain giving them away?
And it was just a matter of time before our only choices would have been abandoning the base altogether or breaking international law.
Britain's Foreign Secretary is right. There has been pressure on Britain, coming chiefly from the UN's International Court of Justice, which ruled the UK has an obligation to bring to an end its administration of the Chagos archipelago as rapidly as possible to complete the decolonisation of Mauritius. A view that is not universally welcomed.
Get out your maps, get out your atlases, check out the Chagos Islands, see where they are, and see where Mauritius is. A long way away.
Yes.
What is this claim? It's nonsense. It's total nonsense. Why are we doing this? Sheer political correctness, desire to look like the good guys, a desire to look as though we're unbundling the last relics of our empire. It's nonsense.
So, who has the best claim to ownership? Well, ever since becoming independent back in the 1960s, the islands have been claimed by Mauritius, which is some 2,200 kilometres away. Some in the Maldives, just 500 kilometres away, think the islands belong to them. But in fact, Britain has owned the islands for over 200 years, taking them from the French after defeating Napoleon in 1814. The French were the first to bring humans to the island, slaves, mostly from Africa, some from India, who worked on their coconut plantations from the mid-1700s. They became known as Chagossians. In the 1960s and 70s, Britain expelled their descendants to Mauritius and the Seychelles at the behest of the Americans so they could build their base on Diego Garcia. Some Chagossians complain they're second-class citizens in Mauritius. Some want to go back to Chagos, while others would actually prefer to remain British.
We deserve to be part of the negotiations, point blank. They shouldn't have made this deal without asking us what we wanted.
Whatever the UN and other bodies decided, it wasn't binding in the UK, and yet Starmer and Foreign Secretary David Lammy agreed to hand over the islands to Mauritius, pay for some Chagossians to resettle there, and pay for a 99-year lease on Diego Garcia. In other words, rent the island it had owned for the past 200 years. What a deal.
We are effectively handing over, giving up a major strategic asset in the Indian Ocean that we didn't need to give up for no conceivable purpose. And you have got to wonder, what on earth is this government doing?
Let's bring in our guest now, and we're about to hear from Maxwell Evenor, whose family is originally from the Chagos Islands. His story of racism in Mauritius may well surprise you. But first, let's hear from a former British MP and a UN expert who have completely opposite views, Henry Smith and Miriam Ekiudoko. Welcome to the programme. So, Maxwell, have a listen to this debate and tell me what you think afterwards. Henry, what is wrong with the deal from your perspective?
Well, there are a number of things that are wrong with the UK handing the Chagos archipelago over to Mauritius, principally that they haven't allowed for a right of self-determination of the Chagos Island people. There were literally a couple of Zoom calls that the UK Foreign Office held with community leaders over the last year. And there's a very important principle in any democracy that people's homelands should be decided, their future should be decided by the people from there. And that hasn't happened in this case. But there are also other concerns as well, environmental concerns. The Chagos archipelago is one of the largest marine protected areas anywhere in the world. It's over 250,000 square miles of protected area. And there are suggestions that Mauritius might allow commercial fishing in that area, and Mauritius has a poor record, unfortunately, in terms of ocean environment conservation. But there are security concerns as well. Diego Garcia is a very strategic base that has been very important during the Cold War. Trouble in the Middle East, and again, as we go back into a Cold War and further problems in the Middle East, and Mauritius is closely aligned with China, and there is a security concern that China may use this opportunity to move into the region. So a number of levels that I think this is a bad deal. Also unnecessary. The judgments that were made by the International Court were only advisory. And the court is made up of the governments of the world, and many of the governments of the world don't like British foreign policy. So I think it was unnecessary, but I suspect it will happen because, of course, Keir Starmer and his Labour government now have a huge majority in the British Parliament.
Miriam, you take pretty much the opposite view to Henry. You think that the deal was necessary and you broadly support it. Why?
Well, actually, I agree with Henry's first point about self-determination, and that it's a very huge mistake that the Chagossian community was not properly contacted and was not part of the negotiation and this decision-making of this treaty, but there's still room for that, I believe. However, I completely disagree with all the concerns raised. To start with, the ICJ's ruling, though it was only advisory, but we all know that this was just one little aspect among all the crimes against humanity which the UK committed in the past hundreds of years. The way Mauritius was granted independence was on the condition of handing over the Chagos Islands to the UK, creating a new so-called colony, the British Indian Ocean Territory in 1965, and that's how Mauritius could claim independence in 1968. Now, the conditions under which the Chagossian community, the indigenous people of the Chagos Islands, were forced to leave were not only inhuman and degrading, but they were also completely destructive to the entire community, not only that time, but till this day. Returning the Chagos Islands to Mauritius historically is rightful because the Chagos Islands were part of Mauritius at the time when Britain made this forceful deal with
Miriam,
Mauritius.
can I take that point to Henry? It's an ownership point, Henry. Miriam saying that it's only right to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius because it really belonged to Mauritius in the first place. Is that the case?
So this is indeed an issue about ownership, but the Chagos Islands belong to the Chagos Island people, and that point of self-determination is very important. I would also add that the archipelago is over 1,400 nautical miles away from Mauritius. Indeed, it's closer to the Maldives and India. And therefore, whilst administratively, before the 1960s, it might have occasionally been run as a territory including Mauritius, it's never really been Mauritian. And if you ask the Chagos Islanders themselves if they feel Mauritian, the vast majority say no. You know, I agree that Britain historically has treated the Chagos Islanders appallingly in terms of the way that they were exiled from their homeland. But unfortunately, their experience in Mauritius, where many of them ended up, was far worse. And certainly the vast majority of the community that I represented for over 20 years want to remain British and want the islands to remain British, but it should be their choice. It shouldn't be something that London or Port Louis decides or the UN in New York.
Well, let's do something the British and Mauritians didn't do. Let's bring in someone from the Chagos Islands. Maxwell, please tell us your thoughts on this deal.
My thought on this deal is simply that history is repeating itself, now repeating itself in a sophisticated way. Back in the day, in the 1965s, when my lens, the Chagossian lens, was being given away, when they were forcibly removed, there was a secret deal done between the Mauritius government and the UK's government. This should not have never happened, because this was based on a lie that there was no indigenous people there, and they knew very well that there was indigenous people there. When they deported us, forcibly removed us to Mauritius, when we went to Mauritius, we were living in animal houses. We were always treated as second-class citizens. Now, look in 2024, how many Chagossians have made way to the UK. If there was no good reason to make way to the UK, they would still be there. And if Mauritius claims so much as they have sovereignty on the Chagos archipelago, why is there people in the Seychelles in the first place? Why were people forcibly removed to the Seychelles?
Miriam, how can you trust Mauritius to have and exercise responsible sovereignty over the Chagos Islands when it is well known from people like Maxwell that the Mauritian government and general society treats people from the Chagos Islands very, very badly?
First of all, I'm blaming the United Kingdom for creating this situation. And of course, I am also blaming the Mauritian government and society for marginalizing the Chagossian community, for being marginalized and being put in this very vulnerable situation. However, I believe that part of this treaty should have been that there are guarantees built in where, for example, the funds given to Mauritius for development should directly go to the still living Chagossians in exile and their descendants.
So Maxwell, under this deal, the British will lease the biggest island, Diego Garcia, for around 99 years. And so that excludes Chagossians from returning there. But the Mauritians also have a little deal going on where they say they will only allow Chagossians with a Mauritian passport to resettle on the islands. So what happens to people like you then?
So, as you would notice in the language that was used in the ICJ, which is basically very, very cleverly used to erase our identity, what it says in the judgment is that Chagossians are origin of Mauritian, Chagossians of Mauritian origin. Our identity has been erased by the Mauritian government. I haven't seen any other government do this. We are Chagossians people. We are indigenous people. It is our land. We should have the right to self-determination according to international law. I hope the Mauritian government and the British government now stops what they've been doing for years to us and give us our rights.
Henry, is there any chance this deal can be altered now, or is it unstoppable given the large parliamentary majority that Keir Starmer enjoys?
Well, I don't think that Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, and his new Labour government expected this issue to be front page news in the newspapers and headline news when it was announced on TV, and certainly the backlash that has been seen on social media. I thought they believed that this issue would be somewhere in the back pages of the newspapers and not really get much coverage. So I think they've been quite shocked with the amount of concern that people are expressing that British territory and more importantly, people who Britain has a responsibility to, the Chagos Islanders, who are British citizens, can just hand away their homeland. So I hope there is room for rethinking the agreement. And I would very much want to see the Chagossians to be a key part of deciding the finer detail of any treaty that's signed between London and Port Louis. But as you correctly point out, the Labour government has a huge parliamentary majority, and I think the idea that this won't go through in some form or another, I think, unfortunately, is very unlikely. So, but there is still time that we can get the detail right and make sure that Chagossians' voices are heard much more clearly and their wishes respected, because I think the agreement we all have is both Britain and Mauritius has treated the Chagossian people appallingly, and unfortunately they're in danger of just repeating, as Maxwell says, the injustice yet again over half a century later.
Why hasn't Britain done anything in the past decades to make sure that the Chagossian Islands are handed back to the indigenous people?
I agree.
To the Chagossians, which actually has been denied on several occasions.
Yeah, I think Henry agrees with that. Maxwell, let me ask you, is there much appetite amongst Chagossians for independence?
I think there is a lot of Chagossians that would like independence, and it's because the Chagossians have always lived a self-sufficient life. Our ancestors had always told us they lived a self-sufficient life on the island, and also would like independence exactly because of what they've been doing to us for the past 50 years, 60 years or so. That's what they haven't given us a choice. If you don't have independence, you can't talk for yourself. And this is what other states will do. They will take your rights away from you. They will take your land away from you. This is why I think the Chagossian should really get independence so they can shape up their futures with their aspirations, their political values for their future generations.
Henry Smith, it has been widely reported that Keir Starmer, is friends with the chief legal advisor to Mauritius. A lot of people will start to think this smells a bit.
Well, the first 3 months of the new Labour government has been a series of errors and mistakes. But it is very concerning that, as you say, widespread reports that the chief legal advisor, who's been the chief legal advisor to the Mauritian government for many years, Philippe Sands, who's a British lawyer, a senior British lawyer, is very good friends with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, who is also a senior British lawyer, and that very quickly on coming into office, this deal is struck. It certainly does raise some very serious questions and concerns.
Maxwell, I'd just like to invite you to tell us about how the British pushed your family out of the Chagos Islands in the 60s, and then you were born in the 90s in Mauritius, and tell us about that experience as well.
I was born in Mauritius in the 1990s. Wasn't easy for myself growing up in Mauritius. The Creole descent in Mauritius are always treated as second-class citizen. We have a very hard time with the government. with the police, not enough opportunities at school, in education, jobs, and it has been very, very hard.
And you're generally in favour of independence rather than remaining British. Do you think
I am in favour of what my people will decide. Chagossians need to get the choice to decide their future. It has been far too long that we haven't been able to shape and choose our future. If our population choose to remain British, I will fully respect that. So should British, and so should Mauritius, so should the world. If they want independence, then that's their will. We should all respect that.
Maxwell Evenor, Miriam Ekiudoko, and Henry Smith, thank you all very much. Much appreciated. Well, it's been reported that US President Joe Biden pushed Keir Starmer to sign this deal, just in case Mauritius managed to convince the United Nations to legally force the UK to hand over the islands and put access to Diego Garcia at risk. Here's what the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said about the base last year.
On Diego Garcia, I can just say, as David said, look, this is a joint US-UK military facility that plays a vital role in the Indo-Pacific region. For us, it plays a vital role in global security. It enables our own support for regional stability, gives us an ability to respond rapidly to crises, and also to counter some of the most challenging threats that we face.
Well, let's take a closer look at this now with the former Pentagon official, David Des Roches, who is in Washington. David, welcome back to the program. So after this deal, is the United States and the United Kingdom more or less secure?
Probably marginally less secure. I mean, obviously there's an element of control that's being given up, but the United States interests are preserved by a 99-year lease. I think that some of the strategic arguments are really being generated by internal British politics. At the end of the day, the Mauritians have no great love for China. They've been badly burned on two infrastructure investment projects with the Chinese. The Indians probably have more of an interest there, but we're secure with a base that's surrounded by Cuba with a land border all around it, and I think this base will be secured given the geographic distance from the other islands in the Mauritius.
It's a very different take on the one we have here domestically in the UK. Mm-hmm. Well, they say that if Mauritius chooses, they can allow China to have one of the other islands nearby Diego Garcia as a sort of a listening post. What do you think of that?
That is possible, yes. And but again, I think that would not come for cheap. And I think that Mauritius's natural line of drift is towards India, not China. And they would probably oppose it given India's influence. India is the real big player here. And I think that India would lean heavily on the Mauritians to do that. But yeah, you're right. That is a possibility. There's a lot of internal British things, just there's a trend towards decolonization. What really gets me here is that the Chagossians don't consider themselves to be Mauritians. And many of the Chagossians, those who don't live in Mauritius, they won't be allowed back. So in many aspects, they're substituting a lack of sovereignty to the British for a lack of sovereignty to the Mauritians, which they probably will be treated worse by.
Oh, for sure. And your point about the Mauritians gravitating towards India makes complete sense. When you look at the demographics, around 2/3 of Mauritians are actually of Indian origin. Around half are of Hindu religion. Let me ask you about the base itself. Why is it so important?
Well, because it's the only base we have in the Indian Ocean. So the United States has a pretty substantial military presence in the Gulf, but that's obviously constrained by the Strait of Hormuz. And then we have basing rights in Australia, but that's a considerable distance away. And it's many days sailing time. So Diego Garcia originally was there to put our pre-positioned stores that could be moved into the Gulf if there were an issue there. So we wouldn't have a base that with open access, non-choke point constrained access to the Indian Ocean other than Australia without Diego Garcia.
There are commentators who say that this is a very old-fashioned thing for the West to have an outpost, if you like, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And there are others who say, why are you trying to keep China in check? It's not as if they've started all the wars that America has started over the last few decades.
Yeah, good point. I mean, the base is not really about China. It's more about having the capacity to respond to an emerging threat in the Gulf. So, you think Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, you can get an armored brigade in a few days sailing from Diego Garcia into an area where it can move there. So it's a general contingency base. It's not for a specific threat, and it would be of marginal use at best in the event of a conflict with China. It's not big enough to be a large throughput support base to move forces, say, to the Philippines. Our lines of logistics would run across the Pacific, not across the Indian Ocean.
David Des Roches, thank you very much once again for your analysis. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, you can go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.